The table went over with a sound that stopped every fork in the room, a full dinner service, plates and wine and a heavy soup tureen, crashing across the tile of a restaurant packed with families on a Friday night. And in the sudden silence after it, the giant who had kicked it stood over the wreckage, breathing hard, waiting. He was waiting for the small man at the table to leap to his feet, because that was the entire point of what he had just done. The small man did not leap to his feet. He sat in his chair with his hands resting on his knees and looked up at the giant and did not move at all. To understand why a man would flip a stranger's dinner table in a room full of children and why the stranger would refuse to stand up and answer it, you have to go back about 10 minutes to when the giant walked in and to what everyone in that neighborhood already knew about him. His name was Frank Mazo, and he was the reason a lot of people in that part of the city ate somewhere else. He had been a competitive bodybuilder once, a good one, a regional champion with a wall of trophies, and when the winning stopped, he had found that the body he'd built was worth more as a threat than it had ever been as an art. He did collections now. He stood behind men who lent money at bad rates, and he leaned on the people who couldn't pay, and he had learned across 10 years that a human being that size, up close, with the right look on his face, almost never actually had to do anything. The threat was the product. He rarely had to spend it. A shopkeeper counted out the money faster when Frank filled the doorway. A man behind on a debt found it, somehow, when Frank sat down across from his family at breakfast. Fear did the work, and fear had done the work for so long that Frank had come to believe it was the only real currency there was, that everyone underneath was afraid, and that the ones who pretended not to be were simply waiting to be shown. He had never once in 10 years met a person that theory did not explain. He was about to... That restaurant was one of the places he liked to be seen. It was a good room, white tablecloths, an old immigrant family that had run it for 30 years, the kind of place where being feared felt like being important. He came in without a reservation the way he always did, and the owner sat him without a word the way he always did, and Frank looked around the room to see who was watching him be big. Almost everyone was, in the careful way you watch a large dog, except one man, at a small table near the center, eating alone, in a plain black jacket. A slight man, Chinese, calm, entirely absorbed in his meal and his own thoughts, who had not looked up when Frank came in, and did not look up now, and something about that, about a small man being the one person in the room not tracking him, caught in Frank like a splinter. If you want to understand how a quiet dinner became the thing that neighborhood talked about for 20 years, stay with this, because it started with the smallest thing, with Frank simply being unable to stand, not being feared by one man. He started small, the way men like him do. He sent over a drink the diner hadn't asked for, and watched, and the small man thanked the waiter politely and did not touch it. He made a loud joke to no one about people who came to a nice place and didn't know how to enjoy it, and watched, and the small man went on eating. Each non-reaction fed the thing in Frank instead of starving it, because a bully's whole self is built on the reactions of others, and a man who will not react is, to that kind of person, a kind of insult that cannot be allowed to stand. So Frank got up and walked over and stood at the small man's table, close, looming, using the size, casting the man in his shadow. He said some things. The waiter, a young man named Tomas, who had worked there since he was 15, hovered nearby, not knowing what to do. Frank told the small man that he didn't like his face. He told him this was his restaurant, his neighborhood, and that strangers who couldn't show respect could eat somewhere else. The small man set down his chopsticks and looked up and said mildly, without any edge at all, that he didn't want any trouble, and that he was almost finished, and that he'd be gone soon, and Frank could have the whole room. That should have been enough for anyone. For Frank it was gasoline, because it was calm, and calm was the one thing his entire life had taught him to read as a challenge. And so he did the thing the whole room would remember. He stepped back, and he drove his boot into the edge of the table and flipped the man's entire dinner into the air and across the floor. The crash, the whine, the tureen shattering, a woman 2 tables over crying out, a child starting to cry somewhere near the window. And the small man did not stand up. Here is the part worth staying for, because everyone in that room, including Frank, misread it. They thought the stillness was fear. They thought the small man was frozen, that the size and the violence had finally found the bottom of him. Frank certainly thought so, and it delighted him, and he leaned down and asked loud whether the little man was going to sit there in the mess, or whether he was going to get up and be a man about it. And the small man looked up at him from the chair, past the wreckage of his own dinner, and what was in his face was not fear, it was a decision that had already been made, and it was this, that standing up was exactly what Frank needed, that the whole point of the table, and the noise and the shattered tureen, was to make the small man rise and turn a family restaurant into a brawl, and that he was not going to give a room full of frightened people a fight to be caught in the middle of. He would sit. He would let Frank be as big as Frank needed to be. He would not be moved, because being moved was the only victory available to a man like this, and he had decided not to hand it over. He said quietly, "I'm still not going to give you what you want." And that broke something in Frank, because it named the thing, and men like Frank cannot bear to have the thing named. He had failed to make the man afraid, and he had failed to make him stand, and a bully who cannot produce fear or a fight has nothing left, and the nothing curdles into something worse. He looked around the room for someone who would give him the reaction the small man wouldn't, and his eyes landed on Thomas, the young waiter, who had crouched to start picking up the broken dishes, and Frank, humiliated, enraged, needing to hurt something, grabbed the heavy metal wine bucket off a stand and hurled it, hard, straight at the kneeling boy's head. Stay with this, because this is the half-second the entire night had been walking toward, and nobody in that room ever forgot it. The small man moved. Not up. That is the thing the witnesses could never quite make people believe afterward. He did not stand. From the chair, from a dead-seated stop, his hand came up and across, and he caught the flying wine bucket out of the air, an inch from the back of Thomas's skull. Caught it clean, the full weight of it, the momentum of a grown man's furious throw, absorbed and stopped by one hand that had been resting on a knee a heartbeat earlier. There was ice water down his sleeve, and a dent in the metal where his fingers had closed, and the boy was unhurt, and the small man was still in his chair, and his face had not changed at all. The room made no sound. It was not the silence of fear anymore. A man at the next table had half risen with his napkin still tucked into his collar and forgotten it there. The woman who had cried out a minute earlier now had both hands flat on the tablecloth, perfectly still. An old waiter by the kitchen door had stopped with a coffee pot in his hand, and did not seem to know he was holding it. It was the silence of a whole room's collective instinct recalibrating at once, because every person in that restaurant had just watched a man do a thing that should not have been possible, from a sitting position, without apparent effort, to save a busboy none of them had even been looking at. Frank stared at the quart bucket. He stared at the small man's face, which was, for the first time all night, no longer mild. The small man set the wine bucket down on the floor, gently, without a splash, and then he spoke, and his voice was still quiet, but the quality of it had changed, and the change was more frightening than any shout. He said, "Everything until now was between you and me, and I let it be nothing." He said, "You just threw metal at a boy's head." And he said one more thing, looking up at the giant from the chair he had never left. "That was the last thing you get to do in this room." Frank did the only thing his life had left him equipped to do. He swung a real punch now, all of it, a decade of collections and a champion's shoulders behind it, down at the seated man's face. And the small man, still seated, did the last small thing of the evening. He did not lean away. He turned inside the punch, caught the great wrist as it came, and used the one asset Frank had spent the whole night handing him, his own committed downward overbalanced weight, and guided it past, adding nothing but direction, so that Frank's own tremendous force carried him forward and down over the small table, with nothing at the end of it, and the giant who had terrorized a neighborhood for 10 years crashed full length into the wreckage of the dinner he'd made, among the broken plates on the floor, at the feet of a room full of the people he'd spent his life frightening. The small man was still in his chair. He had turned perhaps 90 degrees in the seat. That was all. And nobody helped Frank up. That was the part that finished him, and it is why this story does not end the way you might expect, because there was no hand offered, and no lesson given, and no quiet word of respect, because this was not a proud champion who had tested a stranger. This was a man who had thrown metal at a child, and the small man owed him nothing and gave him nothing. He simply sat and watched Frank flounder up out of the broken china, soaked in wine and humiliated in the one currency he had, and the room watched too, and Frank saw in 200 faces the thing he had spent 10 years making sure he never saw, that they were not afraid of him anymore. The spell that had let him walk into any room in that neighborhood had broken on a restaurant floor in front of everyone, and it was never coming back, and he knew it, and he left, not thrown out, just leaving, because there was nothing left in that room for a man whose only tool was a fear that had just evaporated. The small man got up then, finally, out of the chair, but not to fight anyone. He got up to help Tomas finish picking up the broken dishes. He crouched down beside the shaking young waiter and gathered the larger pieces, and asked him quietly if he was all right, and told him the diners near enough to hear it repeated it for years, that he had done nothing wrong, that a man who throws things at people who are only trying to do their jobs is the smallest kind of man there is, no matter how big he is, and that Tomas should never once let a night like this make him feel otherwise. The owner tried to compin the meal, tried to give him everything in the kitchen, and the small man declined all of it, and paid his bill in full, and left a large sum for the waiter, and a larger one for the broken dishes, and thanked the owner for the food, which he said had been very good, and which he had barely gotten to eat. Frank Mazo did not come back to that neighborhood in any way that mattered. Fear had been the whole of his power, and it does not survive being seen through in public. The people who had paid him and flinched at him began slowly to stop, because a story travels, and this one traveled fast. The night the giant kicked over the wrong man's table and a small stranger caught a wine bucket out of the air without leaving his seat. Some versions grew in the telling, the way these things do, but the part that stayed the same in every version, the part that the people who were actually there always came back to, was not the throw at the end, and was not even the catch, extraordinary as it was. It was that for 4 long minutes. A very dangerous man did everything in his considerable power to make a small stranger stand up and fight, and the stranger would not do it, would sit there and take the insults and the shove and the ruin of his own dinner, and give the room no violence to be frightened of, and that the one and only thing on earth that finally moved him was not a single word said to him or a single thing done to him. It was a boy he'd never met, kneeling on the floor about to be hurt for no reason. That was the thing worth standing up for. Everything else he'd been content to let go,